You know, I'd say my connection to our Father gives me a unique advantage against the creatures of the night. You see, I'm a holy man. I gave my life to the Lord during my time in prison. I was sentenced to 15 years for an armed robbery that left my brother dead. That's the clean version, anyway. The version printed in the newspapers said Nathan was killed by an off-duty police officer while fleeing the scene. It said I surrendered without incident. What it didn't say was that I held my brother on the floor of a liquor store while blood pumped between my fingers. It didn't say he looked me in the eyes and asked me not to let him die. And it sure as hell didn't say that for 3 nights after they put me in county lockup, something wearing Nathan's face stood outside my cell. Father Anselm was the prison chaplain back then, the first person who believed me. He was also the first vampire hunter I ever met. I didn't learn that until years later. By then, I had served 12 years, earned an early release, completed seminary, and became Father Daniel Ward of St. Jude's Catholic Church in eastern Tennessee. My parishioners think I spend my nights visiting the sick. Sometimes I do. Other times, I drive 300 miles with a case of holy water in my trunk and a sharpened length of ash wood beneath my coat. The assignments come from Rome, not directly from the Pope, obviously. I'm not that important. They come through an office buried so deep in the church that most bishops don't know it exists. The ONA, Office of Nocturnal Affairs. Monsignor Rourke runs the American branch. I've never met him in person. I've only heard his voice over the phone. He sends black envelopes with no return address. Inside is a photograph, a location, and one instruction. Confirm, contain, cleanse. The envelope, waiting beneath my rectory door that Thursday night, contained all 3. That had never happened before. Inside was a photograph of a small white church surrounded by forest. The steeple leaned slightly to the left, and sheets of plywood covered every window. Written across the bottom in red ink were 7 words: St. Bartholomew's, Amity Hollow, Kentucky, complete before dawn. Beneath that was a second note: recover the ledger. Do not read it. I left after evening mass. Amity Hollow was the kind of town you could pass without realizing you had driven through it. 1 road, 1 gas station, a diner with a flickering sign, and a row of houses pressed close to the trees. The population sign said 412. I didn't see a single person. A pickup truck idled in the middle of the road with the driver's door hanging open. Its headlights shone into an empty laundromat. The radio was still playing. I stopped beside it and listened. A preacher spoke through the static. The dead shall be raised incorruptible. Something slammed into the side of my car. The window cracked beside my head. A woman clung to the door. Her jaw hung open farther than it should have, and blood soaked the front of her nightgown. Black veins crawled beneath her skin. She punched through the glass, and her fingers closed around my collar. I grabbed the vial hanging from my neck, tore the stopper free with my teeth, and threw holy water into her face. She released me with a scream. Steam rolled from her eyes. I kicked the door open, knocking her backward, and climbed out with the ash stake already in my hand. She moved fast. Newly turned vampires usually do. They haven't learned patience yet. She came at me low, teeth and fingernails. I stepped aside, caught her by the hair, and drove the stake through her back. It punched between her ribs and into her heart. Her body stiffened. For a second, she almost looked human again. Then, she collapsed into a pile of gray ash and clothing. A man stood beneath the gas station canopy. Then another stepped from the diner, and 5 more emerged from the houses. Every one of them turned toward me at the same time. Confirmation complete. I got back into the car and drove. They chased me almost half a mile. One managed to climb onto the trunk of my car. I watched him crawl toward the rear window, his broken fingernails scraping across the roof. I slammed the brakes, and he went flying off the car and hit the road. Before he could rise, I drove over him. The body cracked beneath the tires. Didn't kill him, but it sure as hell slowed him down. St. Bartholomew's stood 2 miles outside town, surrounded by a cemetery and a wall of black trees. The iron gates were chained shut. I drove through them. The chains snapped. One gate folded beneath the bumper and dragged under the car until I reached the church steps. I opened the trunk and pulled out my hunting kit. 3 bottles of holy water, a box of blessed ash, 6 ash stakes, a silver crucifix, 2 gallons of consecrated oil, and an old 12-gauge shotgun Father Anselm had left me when he died. The shells were packed with silver fillings and fragments of communion wafers. Sacrilegious? Possibly. Effective? Absolutely. The side door of the church opened before I reached it. An old priest stood inside, Father Kellen. His white collar was stained brown with dried blood. One eye had swollen shut, and his left arm hung uselessly at his side. "You're late," he said. Behind me, screaming carried through the woods. The townspeople were coming. Then help me close the door. We slammed it together. Kellen dropped a wooden beam into the pair of iron brackets. The first vampire struck the other side hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. "How many?" I asked. "Nearly the whole town." "How many are inside?" He looked toward the sanctuary. "The rest." The pews had been pushed against the walls. Symbols had been painted across the floor in salt, ash, and what smelled like sacramental wine. At the center of the sanctuary was a trap door wrapped in iron chains. Something heavy struck it from below. The chains jumped. "The church was built as a containment house," Kellen said. "Consecrated iron in the foundation. Holy relics inside the wall. As long as the bell rings, they can't cross the property line." The pounding at the front door grew louder. Wood splintered. Then ring it. "The rope was cut." Of course it was. Nothing is ever simple. Kellen pointed toward the stairwell leading to the bell tower. "You'll have to climb." The trap door burst open. The chains whipped across the sanctuary and tore through a pew. Hands reached from the darkness. Dozens of them. Kellen grabbed my arm. "Run." I pulled the shotgun from beneath my coat. I'm not here to run. The first vampire climbed out. He wore the remains of a police uniform. Half his face had been chewed away, but he still had enough mouth left to smile. I fired. The shot took him in the chest and threw him back into the hole. The vampires beneath him screamed. Not from the silver, from the pieces of consecrated bread burning inside their flesh. They poured through the opening. Men, women, an elderly woman still wearing her hospital gown, a teenager in a football jersey. They crawled over one another, snapping and clawing, fighting to reach us first. I fired again. Then the shotgun clicked empty. Kellen swung a brass candle holder and crushed one of the vampire's jaws. Another landed on his back. I grabbed it by the collar and pressed the crucifix against its forehead. Its skin blackened beneath the silver. By the authority of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the thing shrieked. I shoved it back into two others and scattered blessed ash across the floor. The powder ignited beneath their feet. White fire raced through the symbols painted across the sanctuary, forming a burning circle around the trapdoor. The vampires trapped inside it began tearing at one another in panic. The front doors exploded inward, and the rest of Amity Hollow rushed into the church. So much for containment. Kellen pointed toward the tower. "Go, I'll hold them." "You can barely stand." "Then I'll die sitting down." He kicked open a cabinet beside the altar. Inside were 4 glass bottles filled with clear liquid. He lit a rag stuffed into the first, and I understood. "Try not to burn the ledger," I said. Kellen smiled. "Try not to fall off the tower." He threw the bottle. Fire rolled across the entrance. I moved. The stairwell was narrow and steep. The old wood cracked beneath my weight. Something followed me. I heard claws striking each step. I turned at the landing and saw a vampire crawling along the wall, its arms and legs bent backward like a spider's. I drove a stake through its throat, but it kept coming. I shoved the stake deeper until the point entered its skull. The body dropped, knocking over another vampire. I continued climbing. The bell smelled of pigeon shit, rust, and cold night air. The bell hung above me. It was enormous. Bronze, blackened with age, with Latin prayers carved around its rim. The severed rope lay in a heap on the floor. A woman stood beside it. She wore a nun's habit. At least, it had once been one. The gray fabric had been stitched directly into her skin. Iron chains hung from her wrists, each link engraved with tiny prayers. Her face was pale, almost beautiful. Then she smiled at me with too many teeth. "Father Ward," she said, "Rourke's newest dog. You must be Miriam." "I was Miriam once." She moved before I could raise the crucifix. Her hand closed around my throat and drove me against the bell. The impact rang it. The sound tore through my skull. Miriam screamed and released me. Below us, every vampire in the church cried out. The bell had worked. I grabbed the severed rope and wrapped it around the wheel. Miriam struck me across the back. I hit the floor hard enough to lose my breath. She crouched beside me. "Ask Rourke what happened to your brother's body." She leaned closer. "Ask him why Nathaniel Ward never reached the morgue." I drove the silver crucifix into her cheek. She recoiled, smoking. I pulled the rope, and the bell rang again. Miriam dropped to one knee. Downstairs, windows shattered as vampires threw themselves against the walls, desperate to escape the sound. I pulled again. The bell's wooden support cracked. I looked up. The beam split down the middle. The bell tore loose. I jumped toward the stairs and Miriam lunged after me. The bell crashed through the tower floor, and it took her with it. Wood, bronze, and screaming vampires collapsed into the sanctuary below. The impact broke the church apart. The bell struck the trap door and plunged into the crypt, dragging half the floor with it. I landed on the staircase and nearly went through the railing. Below me, Kellen lay beside the altar. Miriam had torn his throat open. He was still alive, but barely. I crawled to him. He pressed a black iron key into my palm. "Beneath the altar," he whispered. "The ledger." Then his eyes moved past me. Miriam climbed from the wreckage. The bell had crushed one side of her body. Her left arm hung by strips of flesh. She was still smiling. I picked up one of Kellen's burning bottles. Miriam rushed at me. I threw it into the crypt. Flames erupted beneath the church. The consecrated oil caught first, then the ancient wood. Fire ran through the walls like blood through veins. Every vampire in St. Bartholomew's began to burn. Miriam grabbed me as I reached the doors. Her fingers sank into my shoulder. I turned and drove the iron key into her eye. She screamed, and I kicked her backward into the sanctuary. The burning bell rope dropped around her neck. I pulled, and she fell to her knees. "In the name of the Father," I said, wrapping the rope around my arm, "the Son, and the Holy Spirit." The bell shifted inside the crypt. The rope tightened as Miriam was dragged across the floor and into the flames. Her screams followed me out of the church. I didn't stop walking until I reached the cemetery. St. Bartholomew's burned behind me. The vampires outside the church collapsed one by one as the bell continued to toll beneath the wreckage. By the time dawn touched the trees, nothing remained alive inside the property, or undead. The iron box beneath the altar survived the fire. I found it beneath a section of fallen stone after the flames died down. The key Kellen had given me opened it. Inside was a black leather ledger. I remembered Rourke's instructions. Do not read it. I read it. The first pages contained names, dates, blood types, and infection rates. The latter pages contained photographs, priests, soldiers, politicians, people who had supposedly died years earlier. Each picture had a classification stamped beneath it. Asset, failure, terminated. I turned one more page. Nathan stared back at me, older than he had been when he died, paler, a priest's collar around his throat. Beneath the photograph, someone had written, Ward Nathaniel, Asset 17, Field Director, active. I closed the ledger. So yeah, I'm a full-time priest and a part-time vampire hunter. The 6th commandment says, "Thou shalt not kill." But these abominations are already dead, and I won't stop until the world is cleansed.